Story 1. Reg always believed in finishing what he started. In for a penny, in for a pound, he would say. To him, there was no point in starting something if you weren't going to see it through to the end. This belief guided many decisions in his life. When Reg went to study law at university, he realized halfway through the first year that it wasn't for him. The idea of defending someone he knew was guilty didn't sit well with him. The best lawyers could do it, but he knew deep down that he couldn't. Despite this, he didn't quit. He pushed through the 4 years and earned his law degree. Along the way, he made lifelong friends and gained enough legal knowledge to represent himself when he was unfairly fired from an insurance company. He won the case, saving a lot of money in legal fees. Reg also applied this philosophy to his personal life. He stayed married to his first wife, Dolores, even after their relationship turned sour. They had 2 children, Tom and Diane, and he believed that being a father was a lifelong commitment. Although their relationship started to deteriorate after 8 years, he stayed for another 10 years. Dolores often insulted him, even in front of their children. Despite the lack of love between them, he stayed because he didn't want to lose his kids. He was sure that if they divorced, Dolores would take the kids out of spite, and he wouldn't see them during their teenage years. Those years, though challenging, were precious to him, and he wouldn't trade them for anything. Reg even applied his principle to his hobbies. He watched the entire series of Game of Thrones, even though the ending was disappointing. At a role-playing convention, he bonded with another fan over their shared frustration with the finale. That fan, Lucy, eventually became his partner. She was a wonderful person, and Reg loved her deeply. His belief in seeing things through had brought him many rewards. One day, he remembered a book he had read called The Incredible Shrinking Man by Richard Matheson. It was a depressing story about a man who was exposed to a gas that made him shrink continuously. His wife forgot about him, and he lived in the basement. During his shrinking journey, he had a brief romance with a tiny woman from a visiting circus, but he eventually shrank past her size. In the basement, he had to fight for his life against spiders, using a pencil as a spear. It seemed hopeless. Every time he slept, he woke up smaller. He thought his last night had come when he woke up in the subatomic realm, where new adventures awaited him. Reg was glad he had finished the book. While Reg found value in seeing things through, his brother Pat was different. Pat never finished anything. He dropped out of his English degree because he found the other students too pretentious. He quit his job as a tour guide because he didn't get along with his boss. Reg tried to tell him that most bosses were difficult, but Pat didn't care. Instead of sticking it out, he quit and moved on. Pat's tendency to give up extended to his relationships. Reg watched him break up with girlfriend after girlfriend for trivial reasons. One wasn't funny enough, another wasn't smart enough. Pat saw too many red flags in them. But Reg thought these flaws were minor and common to everyone. Pat regretted breaking up with one woman named Alice. She was beautiful, kind, and fun to be around. However, she was always about 20 minutes late. Reg tried to convince Pat that it wasn't a big deal and suggested reading a book or going on his phone while waiting, but Pat couldn't tolerate her imperfection. After all the quitting, Pat ended up with little to show for his life. He had no family, no job, and only one friend, Reg. Eventually, he took his own life at the age of 43. Reg was devastated and kept wondering why Pat ended his life when things might have turned around at 44. Reg missed his brother. Despite his flaws, Pat was a good listener and a great companion for watching silly movies. Not long after Pat's death, a publishing company expressed interest in one of his poems. With Reg's help, it was published posthumously. This experience reinforced Reg's belief that you never know what the future holds. On a quiet Sunday, Reg had the house to himself. Lucy was out with her friends at a Korean restaurant. He knew they would spend hours there, eating and chatting. Reg planned to relax, listen to podcasts, and work on his Lego Death Star. He loved Lucy, but he also cherished this alone time to reflect on the week. Everything was set up for a perfect day when he noticed something snagging on his cardigan sleeve. It was a hangnail on his left thumb. It was annoying but manageable. Reg had a system for dealing with hangnails. He filled a small dish with warm water and soaked his thumb to soften the nail. Then, using tweezers, he would pull out the hangnail. He set up his surgical bay on the couch, with the dish and tweezers ready. The whole process wouldn't take long, and soon he would be building his Lego Death Star. He connected his phone to a Bluetooth speaker and started his favorite podcast, Pod People, which covered true crime, cults, and conspiracies. This episode was about Joseph Fritzl, who kept his daughter locked in a basement for 24 years. Reg felt a bit guilty for listening to such dark content, but reminded himself that the podcast was popular for a reason. The hosts were two American friends, one Christian and the other a death metal fan. They had a running joke where the wholesome one accused the other of enjoying the macabre stories. Listening to the podcast felt like hanging out with friends. Reg set a timer on his watch and soaked his thumb. After 2 minutes, he took the tweezers and gripped the hangnail. He winced in anticipation of the pain, but knew it was necessary. A hangnail would interfere with his Lego building, so it had to go. With the hangnail gone, Reg could finally enjoy his relaxing Sunday. He reflected on his life, his philosophy of seeing things through, and the lessons he had learned from his brother Pat. He knew that life was unpredictable, and that sticking it out often brought unexpected rewards. Reg braced himself and pulled at the hangnail. He felt the sharp pain and saw the blood, but there was no relief. When he wiped away the blood, the hangnail was still there, sticking out from his thumb joint. Reg was puzzled. He had never seen a hangnail go this far. He looked at it with curiosity, wondering how it was possible. Hangnails usually came from the nail bed, right? Could this one be coming from deeper inside? Maybe the bone. As he thought about it, his mind wandered to his garden. He looked out the window at his small back garden, which was about 5 by 7 meters with a little tool shed. He was proud of his roses, called Scarlet Carsons. They were dormant now, but he looked forward to spring when they would bloom in bright red. Reg wanted to think about happy things like his Lego project, the garden, or maybe having a nice cup of tea. But the hangnail demanded his attention. The laughter from his favorite podcast annoyed him because he knew he couldn't relax until he dealt with the hangnail. It was just a hangnail, although a very long one, so he figured he should pull it out. It might even be a funny story to tell Lucy when she got home, although she didn't like gross things. Reg grabbed his tweezers and started pulling again. This time it felt like pulling a cable from underground. He kept pulling, but the hangnail kept coming out longer and longer. He felt lightheaded and had to stop, but the hangnail was still attached. Reg was getting frustrated. His plans for a relaxing Sunday were slipping away. The hangnail was now almost 2 inches long, coming from the base of his thumb. He decided to search for help online using his phone. Unfortunately, Google didn't provide any useful answers. Some people had hangnails surgically removed, and there were things called bone slivers, but those were from serious injuries. The pictures he saw didn't match his situation. Reg got distracted and bought a book he didn't need while on his phone. He knew he was procrastinating. He had to deal with the hangnail before he could get back to his day. He grabbed the hangnail, now long enough to use his other hand instead of the tweezers, and started pulling again. The pain was intense, like a robot pulling out its own wires. Meanwhile, the podcast host started advertising a health drink. Reg didn't want to let go of the hangnail, so he couldn't skip the ad, which added to his frustration. He had seen the drink on YouTube. It was green and looked like something for a sick cow. Reg had to stop again, and the hangnail was now sticking out of his wrist, just above his watch strap. He removed his watch and realized he needed to take off his shirt to keep pulling. Taking off his shirt over the hangnail and wound caused more pain. He threw the shirt aside and saw that the paper towel he was using couldn't stop the bleeding. He needed a proper towel. He went to get a towel, leaving drops of blood on the carpet. Lucy would be upset when she saw the mess. He found a tea towel and wrapped it around his arm. Reg noticed how calm he was being. He was usually anxious, but he was calm during crises. He sat back down, holding his hand in the towel as if it might fall off. The absurdity of the situation made him laugh. He cleaned up the blood as best as he could and used the towel to get a better grip on the hangnail. Reg thought, in for a penny, in for a pound, and started pulling again. The hangnail was digging a trench down his arm. He screamed from the pain, which felt like hot needles piercing his bone. He had to keep screaming to keep going. Reg wondered if the neighbors could hear him. Norris, the retired doctor next door, might. Rationally, Reg knew he should get medical help, but he wanted to handle it himself. The hangnail was almost at his elbow now. He could wrap it around his right hand to get a good grip, which made him gag. He rested for a moment. The hangnail was now almost at his shoulder. Reg could see the damage, but tried not to think about it, knowing it would break his resolve. Every inch he pulled felt like fighting a battle in World War I, with his flesh as the casualties. Reg tried to pull again, but the pain was too much. He only moved the hangnail a millimeter and was hit with an intense pain in his shoulder that spread everywhere. It shattered his determination. I just need a second, he thought, leaning face down on the couch. He could smell the faint scent of last night's curry. Thinking of Lucy made him sob. He hated showing weakness. He wanted to be in her arms, telling her about this instead of experiencing it. The thought of her finding him like this pushed him to sit up. Reg considered giving up. Maybe he could live with the hangnail, cut it off at the shoulder, keep it covered and trim it occasionally. But he couldn't trust it. What if it grew and reached for Lucy while he slept? No, he couldn't live with it. One of them had to go. His mind tuned back into the podcast. The hosts were laughing, which irritated him. Didn't they know people were suffering? He didn't turn it off, though thinking silence would be worse. Then he got the idea to run his arm under cold water. Reg went to the kitchen and placed his arm under the tap. He watched the water run red, not wanting to look at his arm. When he did, he threw up. It looked like he had put his hand in a combine harvester. Standing by the sink with the tap still running, Reg felt a mix of relief and horror. The taste of vomit lingered in his mouth. He knew he wouldn't feel right until the hangnail was gone. Reg wondered how long the hangnail had been inside him. He had always been prone to illness and fatigue. Maybe this intruder had been there all along, taking his nutrients. His curiosity grew. How far did it go? He turned off the tap and dried himself with a mostly clean towel. The soaked one lay useless on the counter. He hated to think about how much flesh he had lost and would lose. To finish this battle, Reg needed better tools. He thought about his garden shed where he kept his DIY stuff. He remembered a movie where a character replaced his hand with a chainsaw. Reg didn't need a chainsaw, but liked the imagery. "You've got a big surprise coming," he said to the hangnail. It was almost 2 feet long now, stiff and bobbing alongside his arm like a sinister erection. Just looking at it made his stomach turn. Reg put on his coat and boots to go outside, determined to end this ordeal. Reg thought about giving up. Maybe he could live with the hangnail. He could cut it off at the shoulder, keep it covered under his clothes, and trim it every now and then. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. But then he changed his mind. He couldn't trust the hangnail. What if it wasn't happy with just his flesh? What if one night, while he was sleeping, it moved towards Lucy, looking for more to take over? No, he couldn't let that happen. There was only room for one of them in his body. His mind went back to the podcast. The hosts were laughing about what a woman had gone through. Reg couldn't believe it. Didn't they know people were suffering? Still, he didn't turn it off. Somehow, he thought the silence would be worse. Then he got the idea that running his arm under cold water might help. He went into the kitchen and put his arm under the tap. He watched the water because he couldn't bring himself to look at his arm. The water ran red with blood for much longer than he liked. He didn't want to be afraid, so he forced himself to look. What he saw made him throw up. It looked like his hand had been through a combine harvester. Reg stood by the sink, the tap still running, washing away the mix of vomit and blood. The taste of vomit lingered in his mouth. It felt good to get it out, but he knew he wouldn't feel right until the hangnail was gone. He wondered how long the hangnail had been inside him. Reg had always had a weak constitution, getting sick every flu season and tiring easily. Maybe this intruder had been there all along, taking his nutrients to fuel its growth. Reg's curiosity grew. How far did the hangnail go? He would find out, even if it killed him. He turned off the tap and dried himself with a mostly clean tea towel. The one he had used before was soaked with blood and useless. He hated to think about how much flesh he had lost, and how much more he would lose before the day was over. To win this battle, Reg needed better tools. He thought about his garden shed where he kept his DIY stuff. He remembered a movie where a character lost his hand and then turned it into a weapon. Reg didn't need a chainsaw, but he liked the idea. "You've got a big surprise coming," he said to the hangnail. It was almost 2 feet long now, stiff and bobbing alongside his arm like a sinister growth. Just looking at it made his stomach turn. Reg put on his coat and boots to go outside. Blood from his arm stuck to the inside of his coat, and the numbness in his left hand made it hard to lace his boots. It was overcast outside, mid-December in Ireland. Despite human attempts to change it, nature was keeping to her schedule and had made it chilly. On his way to the shed, Reg stopped by the rose bed. There was nothing to see, and he wondered if he would be alive to see his beloved roses bloom. He opened the door to the shed, which he thought of as his armory. He took his red toolbox from a shelf and placed it on the worktop. He rummaged around for the pliers, feeling a strange pleasure thinking about what he could do to the hangnail. Then he saw something that made him grin. In the center of the worktop was a vise. What better tool to hold the hangnail in place while he ripped it out? Knowing he would lose his nerve if he hesitated, Reg guided the hangnail into the jaws of the vise and turned the wheel. The nail was thin, so he had to turn the wheel all the way to clamp it in place. He realized the best thing to do was to sling the hangnail over his shoulder and turn away from the vise. That way, when he moved forward, he could rip it out. The shed was small, and he was able to reach out and get the fingers of his right hand around the door handle. He was glad at how secure it felt. Reg wasn't religious, but in this dire situation, he whispered a prayer. "Please, let most of me be intact." He pulled himself forward. The nail bit into him, and he was scared it might re-enter him. He found an old sheet used for painting, folded it into a belt, and placed it under the nail. He dragged himself forward again. It felt unnatural to cause himself so much pain, like asking someone to stab him in the chest. Blood splashed onto the ground. With the nail slung over his shoulder, Reg was reminded of the strongman competitions he used to watch with his father and brother when he was a boy. He didn't care much for sports, but those competitions were fun. He thought of those strong men dragging train cars behind them. Maybe they used their teeth, but that couldn't be right. "I'm weak. I can't do it. I'm weak. I can't do it," he thought. Yet he was doing it. His mind was useless in this situation. Only his will mattered. He looked at the damage. There was a deep wound from his shoulder to his left nipple. He couldn't see his nipple, which might have been on the ground with the blood. Oh well, he thought. He wasn't using it anyway. The nail looked stronger than ever, its base an inch across and slightly concave. It had some nerve, acting like it was a normal part of his body. It was clear where the final battle would be. His heart. The hangnail had wrapped its roots around his heart, feeding on his blood. Reg kept pulling forward. It felt like the nail was bonded to him at the molecular level, and ripping it out caused explosions of pain. He kept pulling himself forward, in for a penny. His consciousness wavered, and he held onto the door handle to stay awake and upright. His body begged to shut down. He didn't have to look to know the hangnail was now coming straight from his heart, like a knife left by a betrayer. He only realized he had been screaming when he stopped. Somewhere in the distance he heard a lawnmower. It was Sunday. Lazy Sunday. His chest was almost level with the door now. He opened it and let himself fall to the ground. As he fell, he heard something snap as one of the nail's roots broke. The pain was like a gunshot, but he didn't care. It was his first taste of freedom. Reg could feel a puddle of blood underneath him, like taking a hot bath in the cold November air. This was his life's blood. He could feel the hangnail's grip loosening. He didn't care if it killed him, as long as he died free. Reg resumed pulling and screaming. He was thankful for the money he had spent on the vise, which had mostly been used for cracking walnuts until now. He grabbed handfuls of dirt and grass and dragged himself forward with a strength that seemed to come from the earth itself. He was numb to the pain, numb to the damage he was causing to himself, and deaf to his own screams. He just wanted the hangnail gone. When he woke up, he knew it was over. The hangnail was gone. He felt empty, like a fish that had been gutted. He could feel the wind howling in the empty spaces inside him where the hangnail had been. But it was gone. In a panic, Reg looked around to see where the hangnail was. He didn't want it to crawl back inside him. He didn't think he could face another round. It lay in a black circle of blood-soaked earth, looking dried out, like a dead spider. It looked dead, but he didn't trust it. The base of it, where it had infiltrated his heart, looked like a twisted, thorny heart. He looked down at his chest and saw that the sheet he had used had been turned into a bandage to cover the gaping wound. It was soaked with blood, but he could still see little flakes of white paint. The part near his heart was crumpled up and looked like a rose. That's when he noticed there were arms around him. Lucy. No, they were a man's arms, white and covered with freckles. They held him up in a sitting position. The owner of the arms spoke. It was Norris, his next-door neighbor, who must have come when he heard the screaming. "You're awake," Norris said. "Yes," Reg answered weakly. "What happened? Was it an accident with one of the tools?" Norris must have seen the trail of blood from the shed to where Reg was now. "No, a hangnail," Reg replied. Norris laughed. "Yeah, right," he said. Reg pointed to the remains of the hangnail. "What is it, some kind of root?" Norris asked. "Some kind," Reg answered. We need to get you inside where it's warm, Norris said, sounding concerned. No, Reg said firmly. First we get rid of it. Okay, what would you like me to do with it? Norris asked. Reg wasn't sure if Norris was just humouring him, but it didn't matter as long as they did what was necessary. The compost bin, Reg said, pointing to the end of the garden where there was a large black rectangular bin. Right, Norris said, gently lowering Reg down. Reg watched him, using all his strength to keep his head up. Norris reached for the hangnail. No, Reg shouted. For God's sake, don't touch it. The thing could just be playing dead. Go to the shed, Reg instructed him. There's another sheet. You can use it to wrap it up. Carefully. The urgency in Reg's voice must have gotten through to Norris. Reg was glad to see Norris approach the hangnail with proper caution. Taking the sheet, Norris gingerly wrapped the hangnail, being careful not to touch it. He took the wrapped hangnail to the compost bin and lifted the lid. Reg watched him closely. Reg took composting seriously, and the compost bin was big, about half the size of a skip. Layers of decaying matter would be left there for months, until they turned into rich fertilizer for Reg's beloved rose bed. It would make a good tomb for his enemy. Norris dropped the hangnail inside. Close the lid, Reg said. Norris came back over to Reg, wiping his hands together to signify a job well done. He helped Reg to his feet and carried him like a wounded soldier back into the warmth of the living room. With great care, Norris managed to get him onto the couch with minimal pain. The couch, where this nightmare had begun, now seemed like a lifetime ago. The podcast was still playing, but had moved on to another episode about the Heaven's Gate cult. Reg knew all about it, but let it play anyway. Where do you keep your bandages, Reg? Norris asked. Upstairs bathroom in the medicine cabinet, Reg replied. Norris had been in Reg's house before and knew his way around. He had been over several times for tea, as was expected of his generation. He got to work, and Reg could tell Norris was more comfortable in the familiar territory of helping a patient rather than dealing with that strange route. Reg had never thought highly of Norris. He had always seemed a bit aloof. Norris was a canny businessman as well as a doctor. He had bought a struggling medical journal, restored it, and sold it for a great profit. Although they exchanged friendly neighbourly banter, there was no disguising the fact that Norris's house was twice the size of Reg's and even had a koi pond. Clearly Reg had misjudged him, because here Norris was, helping him in his time of need. You never knew who would be there for you. Reg was in the middle of these reflections when he passed out again. Reg woke up to the sound of gentle laughter and clinking spoons from the kitchen. Lucy was home. Knowing she was there made him feel calm and safe. The messy bandage on his chest had been replaced with a more professional one. Norris must have done it. It was dark outside. He checked his watch. He had been unconscious for 4 hours. The podcast was silent. Lucy didn't like it and called the hosts cackling ghouls. There was a steaming mug on the coffee table. Reg picked it up. The small movement felt like lifting weights, but he was rewarded with a soothing sip of tea. Ah, tea, the nectar of the gods. Hello, he called out, letting Lucy know he was awake. Lucy came into the room. He blinked away tears and held out his arms, feeling like a mummy. She hugged him tightly, and he yelped in pain. Sorry, she said, and hugged him more gently. It's okay, he replied. Tears filled his eyes as he felt the comfort of being cared for. How did you know I'd be awake? He asked, glancing at the tea. I didn't. I just kept making them. That's the 15th one. I wanted you to have something hot when you woke up. Oh, I do, he said, winking. She shook him gently, and he felt waves of pain from his wounds. Ow. Do you think you're in a fit state to make those comments? I am, he said, smiling. Why didn't you call me? She asked, becoming serious. I don't know. And he didn't. Why hadn't he asked for her help? She was his greatest ally. Silly man, she said, and leaned in for a kiss. Norris entered the room at that moment, holding a cup of tea and wearing a friendly smile. Lucy pulled away. Ah, you're awake, Norris said. How are those bandages holding up? He came over to Reg and started checking the bandages. He seemed satisfied and switched to his doctor mode. I'll be back tomorrow to change them. The ones on your arm aren't that serious, but your chest is a concern. You should really go to the hospital. Reg shook his head. The healthcare system was a mess. Unless you were on the brink of death, you'd wait 10 hours to be seen, in a cold waiting room with fluorescent lights surrounded by strangers. He didn't want that. I'll take my chances, he said. I have a good nurse. Suit yourself, Norris said, shrugging. Make sure you get plenty of rest and drink lots of fluids. You patched up my wounded soldier, Lucy said to Norris. How will I ever repay you? Don't worry, he said. The tea and biscuits should cover it. And you have enough money already, Reg thought, and felt bad for thinking it. Money or not, Norris was obviously a caring man. Feeling deep gratitude, Reg held out his hand to Norris, who accepted it. Thank you, Reg said. Not at all. So, Lucy said, Norris said this was all caused by a hangnail, is that right? That's right, Reg said. Lucy couldn't believe it. It's true, Norris said. I saw it myself. It was... He struggled to explain. One for the books. This gave him an idea. In fact, it would make a great entry in the journal. Of course, I'd need to take some pictures. No, Reg said firmly. No one goes near it. Norris backed off. You're the boss, he said. Well, my wife has been texting me. She's ready to send out a search party. I better go. Thanks for the tea, Lucy. Reg, take care. No more life and death battles, at least for a while. Understood, Reg said. Norris left through the front door, exchanging goodbyes with Lucy as he went. With Norris gone, Lucy gave Reg the kiss she had held back. It was a kiss to remember, and made the whole day of fighting seem worth it. She helped him up the stairs, which now felt like climbing a mountain. He got into bed with her, something that always made him happy, even after 5 years together. Under the covers, she began to talk to him in a whisper he knew well. Reg, hun, was it really a hangnail? Yes, he said, feeling defensive. But how did it get so big? Beats me. There was a silence, and Reg felt like saying many things, but they all seemed impolite. Finally, he found the right words. You believe me, don't you? Luce? Whether she did or not, she chose to. Yes, hun, she said, and kissed him on the head. She fell asleep quickly, as she always did, and he was left with the pain, which felt like a chorus of voices vying for his attention. Remember me, they seemed to say. He found that resting his head against Lucy's chest quieted them, and like this, he slept. It was March, a Sunday. Reg had taken the last 3 months off as sick leave, but was scheduled to return to work tomorrow. He looked forward to getting back to normal. He stood in the living room, holding a hot cup of tea. The bloodstains on the carpet had long since been cleaned. Lucy had pretended to complain, but he suspected she was glad it wasn't his body outline she was cleaning. He felt like a new man after getting the hangnail out. There was a spring in his step, and some days he felt 25 instead of 45. Not having an unwelcome passenger draining his life force made a big difference. He had finished the Lego Death Star and several other builds, including Mount Doom from Lord of the Rings, which had over 7,000 pieces. People asked him what his secret was, and he felt like telling them it was buried in the back garden. He looked out at the rose bed. He was delighted to see small green buds starting to appear. Lucy had been applying fresh compost while he recovered, and it had worked. He marveled at nature's resilience and immortality. He noticed something else sticking out of the soil, whitish grey and curved like a banana. He thought it was a piece of trash that had blown over the wall. He went outside to pick it up. He wanted his roses to be perfect. His heart froze when he saw what it really was. The hangnail, alive and about the thickness of his wrist. It extended about a foot from the soil and pointed at him threateningly. Well, he thought, going to the shed to get a trowel, in for a penny, in for a pound. Story 2. The dive bar bathroom smelled like a mix of old beer and harsh cleaning chemicals that couldn't quite hide the bad odor. I leaned against the sink, which was chipped and worn, scrolling through my phone to pass the time while waiting for my turn. That's when I noticed something. It was scratched into the wall next to the mirror in rough, uneven letters. People Knob, followed by a phone number. The handwriting was messy, like it was done in a hurry, but the words were strangely clear. I chuckled quietly. Drunken graffiti was common in places like this, but this one was oddly interesting. I took a picture of it and sent it to my friend's group chat, captioning it, "Found some quality poetry tonight." The replies came quickly. What does that even mean? Drunk people are crazy. Bet it's a prank call. Call it Peter. I laughed and put my phone back in my pocket. No way was I going to call that number. It was probably some joke or scam meant to scare people. Later that night, when I got home, I looked at the picture again. People Knob. What a strange phrase. Who would even think of writing that? A week later, I saw it again. This time, it was at a trendy cafe downtown. I was washing my hands in their sleek, modern bathroom, the kind with sensors for everything. when I saw it faintly etched into the metal edge of the paper towel dispenser, the same messy handwriting and the same phone number. I froze, staring at it. The déjà vu was intense. My mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe the same person had been here. Maybe it was some urban scavenger hunt or a strange marketing campaign. But why people knob? It wasn't clever or catchy, just weird. I shrugged it off and went back to my table, but the encounter stuck in my mind. Over the next week I noticed the phrase in more places. On a park bench near my office, at a bus stop on my way to work, and even faintly scratched into the wood of a restaurant booth where I was having dinner with co-workers. The graffiti wasn't just in seedy places, it was everywhere. At first I ignored it, but then it started to feel like it was following me. 2 weeks after my first encounter, I gave in to my curiosity. I was at home, scrolling through my photos, when I came across the picture I had taken in the dive bar. My thumb hovered over the phone number. I knew better than to call random numbers found on bathroom walls, but the repetition of it had me on edge. What was it, a joke, a secret, something else? I told myself it was probably some bored teenager having fun. I'd call, laugh it off, and move on. Before I could change my mind, I hit the call button. The line connected, but no one spoke. For a moment, there was only silence. Then I heard sounds. Sloshing, gurgling, wet, creepy noises that made my skin crawl. I was confused. Was it a bad connection? A strange audio file? I barely had time to think when I heard faint, muffled screaming in the background. My stomach turned. I gripped the phone tighter, trying to understand. The sounds weren't random. They were deliberate and organic. Whatever was happening on the other end was deeply disturbing and sounded very real. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaky. No answer. Just the wet, squelching noises and tortured screams. I hung up, my heart pounding. For a few minutes, I just sat there, staring at my phone, trying to process what had happened. Maybe it was a prank, a sick joke, but the screams sounded genuine. I tried not to think about it. I shoved my phone in my pocket, turned on the TV, and distracted myself with sitcom reruns. I was just starting to relax when my phone buzzed, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I looked at my screen and swallowed hard. It was the same number calling me back. Against my better judgment, I answered, my hands trembling. The same noises filled my ear, slurping and squelching, accompanied by a bizarre mechanical whirring, like a grinder or a machine chewing through something. The screams were louder and more desperate. "Who is this?" I shouted, panicking. No response, but I could hear someone breathing, heavy, labored breaths between the grotesque sounds. I couldn't take it anymore. "I'm calling the police, you freak!" I yelled, ending the call. I blocked the number and tossed the phone onto the couch. That night, for the first time in years, I double-checked that all my doors and windows were locked. I didn't sleep. Even after making sure all the locks on my doors and windows were secure, I didn't feel safe. I felt like I was being watched. I had no reason to believe the person behind the number knew where I lived, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The call had unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. The wet, organic sounds and the screams played over and over in my mind. I told myself it was a harmless prank meant to scare me, but my gut told me otherwise. The next morning, still tired from lack of sleep, I decided to report the calls. It felt ridiculous walking into the police station to explain what had happened, but it seemed like the right thing to do. I spent the drive there rehearsing what I'd say, trying to make it sound as normal as possible. The desk officer looked unimpressed as I explained. "You called a number scratched on a bathroom wall, and they made noises at you." He raised an eyebrow. I cleared my throat. It wasn't just noises. It sounded like someone was screaming, and there was this mechanical sound. It wasn't normal. The officer leaned back in his chair, yawning. "Look, unless they threatened you or you have proof of a crime, there's not much we can do. It's probably just a pervert having a laugh. Block the number and move on." I felt a spark of irritation. "So, if this person is hurting someone, like the screaming I heard, you'll just ignore it?" He gave me a look that said he was done humoring me. "We get weird calls reported all the time. If it happens again, record it and bring that in. But for now, I suggest you let it go." I walked out of the station fuming. Let it go? Sure. I'd just forget the horrifying sounds and the way my stomach dropped when the number called back. The police clearly weren't going to help. That night, my friends and I decided to go to a new bar downtown. I thought that a few drinks and some good company would help me forget the strange events of the past few days. By the time we arrived, I had already had a couple of beers and was starting to feel a bit more relaxed. The bar was crowded and lively, with dim lights and loud music that made the walls shake. My friends and I found a corner booth, ordered drinks, and shouted over the noise to talk about our week. "Still freaked out about that creepy phone call?" my friend Kyle asked, leaning across the table. I shrugged, not wanting to talk about it. "I blocked the number. I haven't heard anything since." "See," he said with a grin. "Problem solved. You just have to stop attracting weird stuff." I forced a laugh, but I still felt uneasy. After a while, the drinks caught up to me, and I excused myself to go to the bathroom. The hallway leading to the bathroom was narrow and lined with framed vintage posters. The bathroom itself was what you'd expect: dirty tiles, flickering fluorescent lights, and a stall door that didn't close properly. I stepped into the stall and sighed, leaning against the wall. That's when I heard it. Someone entered the stall next to mine, their footsteps heavy. There was something odd about the way they moved, with a dragging sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Then came the noises. Wet, slurping sounds like someone sucking the marrow from a bone. My chest tightened as I recognized the sounds from the phone calls. What were the odds? I froze, straining to hear more. I needed to be sure. As I listened, the noises grew louder and more disgusting. A faint, rhythmic gulping, like something thick being stirred and then swallowed. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced with panic, screaming at me to get out. I zipped up and stumbled out of the stall, barely noticing the flickering lights overhead. I burst back into the main bar area, desperate to leave the building. I didn't care if I sounded crazy. "Guys," I said, grabbing Kyle's arm. "Someone's in the bathroom. It's the same thing from the calls." My friends exchanged looks, clearly skeptical. "What are you talking about?" Kyle asked, frowning. "I'm not joking," I hissed. "Just come look." They followed me, laughing nervously as we made our way back to the bathroom. I pushed open the door, fully expecting to see someone or something inside. It was empty. The bathroom was empty. There were no dragging footsteps and no wet noises, just the faint hum of flickering fluorescent lights, and me, looking like a fool. My friends groaned in frustration. "Dude, you've had way too much to drink," Kyle said, shaking his head. "Wait," I said, pointing to the stall I had been in. The words "People Knob" were freshly scratched into the metal door, the jagged letters standing out starkly against the smooth surface. "What the hell?" one of my friends muttered, leaning in for a closer look. Kyle snorted. "So someone's been writing graffiti in bathrooms. Big deal." "It wasn't here when I walked in," I snapped, my voice rising. "I swear something's going on." Kyle rolled his eyes. "Fine. Let's see how funny this pervert thinks they are." He took out his phone and dialed the number before I could stop him. "No. What are you doing, Kyle?" I shouted. "Are you crazy?" I grabbed for his phone, but he held it out of reach. "You don't get it. Now they'll have your number too." Kyle laughed. "Relax, man. They're probably just a loser, living in their mum's basement. I'll give them a piece of my mind." He held the phone to his ear. A moment later, we heard the line connect, and then his grin faded. His expression changed from amused to confused, then to scared. "What is it, Kyle?" I asked, dread filling my stomach. His voice was barely a whisper. They want to talk to you, Peter." I didn't talk to Kyle for the rest of the night. I barely even said goodbye to my friends as I left the bar quickly. The words, "They want to talk to you," kept repeating in my head, getting louder each time until I felt like my head would explode. The streets blurred past me as I walked home quickly, my palms sweaty. The city lights didn't make me feel safe. Every shadow and every person passing by felt threatening. When I reached my apartment building, I stopped at the sight of my door. It was open a little bit. I stood there for a moment, unable to move. Had I forgotten to lock it? No. I remembered locking it before I left. My stomach twisted as I opened the door, cringing at the creak of the hinges. The living room looked normal. Too normal. My laptop was still on the coffee table. The half-empty bag of chips from earlier was still there. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt heavy. Grabbing the largest kitchen knife I owned, I started to carefully check the apartment. My breath caught in my throat as I looked in the closets, under the bed, and behind the shower curtain. Everything was as it should be. Everything except the bathroom. When I turned the light on, I almost dropped the knife. There it was, People Knob, scratched into the tile above the sink, the same message that had haunted me for days. The jagged letters glared back at me, written in the same handwriting. I stumbled back. This wasn't just a prank. Someone had been in my apartment, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I didn't wait another second. I ran out of the building, knife still in hand, and called my best friend, Jake, asking if I could stay at his place for the night. Jake didn't ask many questions. He was the kind of friend who didn't pry, which was one of the reasons I trusted him. I gave him the short version. Someone had broken into my apartment and left a creepy message. He nodded seriously, offering me a blanket and a beer. The next morning, after calling my landlord and leaving a voicemail explaining why I was leaving, I packed a bag and drove to my parents' house. I couldn't go back to the apartment, not yet. My mum fussed over me like she always did, offering coffee and asking concerned questions. My dad was quieter, thinking deeply as I explained what had happened. "Is this some kind of stalker?" he asked finally. "I don't know," I replied. "The police didn't take it seriously the first time, and now—" I trailed off, unsure of how to explain how serious it felt. My parents did their best to make me feel safe. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. The isolation of their house, the way it sat back from the road, surrounded by tall trees, felt like a barrier between me and whatever was happening. By the second night, I was finally able to get some sleep. The feeling of safety didn't last long. It was my mum's cell phone that rang first. We were sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee and talking about everyday things when she picked it up. Her face looked confused as she checked the screen. "It's for you," she said, holding the phone out to me. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean it's for me?" "I don't know," she said, frowning. "I just feel like it's meant for you." My hands shook as I took the phone from her. "Hello?" There was silence on the line for a moment. Then the familiar sounds started. Slurping, squelching, and the faint hum of a machine grinding in the background. In the distance, quiet but still audible, were muffled screams. I hung up immediately, my heart pounding. The phone slipped from my hand onto the kitchen table. "What is it?" my mum asked, worried. "It's them," I whispered. "They followed me here." I knew then that I couldn't stay at my parents' house any longer. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop. It didn't matter where I went, and the last thing I wanted was for my parents to get involved or hurt. My landlord called me back the next day, promising to change the locks and install security cameras. The police assured me they'd patrol the area. Reluctantly, I agreed to return to the apartment. When I arrived, the building seemed quieter than usual. My neighbors' doors were all shut tight, and the hallways were silent, except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. I unlocked the door, half expecting the graffiti to still be on the bathroom wall, but everything looked clean. The landlord had done a good job of cleaning up. I noticed several new cameras on the way in. Everything seemed fine. I let out a shaky breath and dropped my bag onto the couch. For the first time in days, I felt a bit of hope. Maybe it was over. Maybe I could start getting my life back to normal. Then I noticed a voicemail notification on my phone. It was from my landlord, time-stamped about 30 minutes before I arrived. Somehow, I had missed it. I pressed play, holding the phone to my ear. "Peter, it's Jim," the message began, his voice shaking. "Listen, I was reviewing the security footage from the night of the break-in and... Look, I don't know how to say this, but whatever went into your apartment that night, it never left. It's still in there. I'm on my way with the police. Don't go inside. Whatever you do, don't..." The message cut off. I stood there, frozen. Jim's message hadn't even sunk in yet when I heard a sound coming from the bedroom. It was faint at first, but as I listened it grew louder, a wet, scraping noise, along with the rhythmic thud of heavy footsteps. They were getting closer. I didn't even grab my bag. I bolted out the door and ran down the street. I didn't stop running until I was blocks away and my legs gave out. By the time I collapsed on a bench near a 24-hour diner, my lungs felt like they were on fire. I gulped down air, glancing over my shoulder like a hunted animal. Every shadow on the sidewalk, every passing car, felt like a threat. Jim's voicemail replayed in my mind, his panicked words echoing over the sound of those dragging footsteps. Whatever went into my apartment that night, it never left. I never went back to my apartment again. By the time my landlord and the police arrived, I was already gone. I was sitting in Jake's living room, shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. Jake didn't interrupt, and for once, he didn't even make a joke. When I finished, he sat in stunned silence. "Man, you're not going back there, are you?" he finally asked. I shook my head firmly. "No, I'm done. I'm not going back, not when it knows where I live." And I meant it. Whatever I left behind, clothes, furniture, even my laptop, wasn't worth my life. Jake offered to let me stay at his place for a while, but I knew that wasn't an option. I didn't want whatever it was to follow me there too. I spent the next week at a cheap motel on the edge of town, paying in cash and keeping my phone turned off except to check for updates from the landlord and the cops. Each night, I checked the locks on the door and windows 3 times, slept with the lights on, and kept a knife under my pillow. The landlord called twice. The first time, he left a voicemail saying the apartment was empty when they arrived. According to him, there was no sign of forced entry, no signs of anyone or anything inside. I couldn't help but scoff. The second time, he didn't leave a message. I left town the following weekend. I packed what little I could fit into my car and drove until the city was a distant memory. I settled in a small town a few states away, a quiet place where nobody knew my name. I found a job at a local hardware store and rented a modest room above an elderly couple's garage. For a while, I began to believe I could move on. Unfortunately, as it turns out, the damage was already done. I still see it sometimes. Not the thing itself, thank God, but the signs. Little hints that remind me that it's still out there. A phrase scrawled on a wall in handwriting I don't recognize. A phone number scratched into the edge of a table at a diner. Once I swore I saw the words "People Knob" on a sticky note stuck to the inside of a bus shelter. I never take the bus anymore. Maybe I'm just lucky, but the calls have stopped. I changed my number, disconnected my old phone, and started over with a new device. So far, I've managed to avoid any strange voicemails or late-night calls. The fear, however, still lingers. The nightmares are the worst. In them, I'm back in my old apartment. The walls are covered in the words "People Knob," carved so deeply that the plaster is flaking off. Wet, gurgling sounds fill the air, along with agonized screams that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. In the dream, I know I should run, but my legs refuse to move. Something approaches me, its footsteps slow and heavy, dragging across the floor. I always wake up before I see it. I don't talk about it much anymore. Jake's the only person who knows the full story, and even he avoids bringing it up. It's easier that way, pretending like it never happened. But sometimes, when I see jagged handwriting scratched into a random bathroom stall or a graffiti-covered wall, I wonder how many other people have called that number. And I wonder how many others got out alive. Story 3. Anais was brushing my hair while her parents argued in the other room. Poor Anais, just 5 years old. I was her only source of comfort as her favorite doll. She was a sweet, blonde little girl. I felt bad seeing her suffer. She didn't realize I was alive and conscious. She called me Luna, but my real name was Alice when I was human, a little girl with curly strawberry blonde hair like hers. I had been an immortal doll for nearly a century, motionless most of the time. People thought I was just a very beautiful and realistic doll with lovely hair and a pretty dress. Of course, I was unnaturally beautiful, as dolls made back then were, an idealized image of humans, but lifeless. I could see myself in the mirror and knew I was a true piece of art, something any educated upper-class little girl of my time would have appreciated. I would have loved to have such a doll when I was human. Most of the time, I was unable to move and remained unconscious. I chose to sleep most of the time to save my strength, because being conscious and able to move required a lot of effort and human blood. I avoided draining myself too much, as it would make me almost like an inanimate doll. I never moved during the day because sunlight made it impossible. When I ended up in Anais's home, I dared to move several times while they were sleeping. Anais's father fell asleep watching TV, and I thought it would be a good chance to feed. He had some extra drinks at his birthday party with friends, so he was less sensitive to being bitten. I bit his leg. He felt my sharp fangs but could not stop me. The warmth of his blood and life force took over me. He mumbled some swear words, and I heard the name of the cat among them. You see, I was in a Romanian apartment block in Bucharest, the capital city of Romania. I was born in Edinburgh almost a century ago and came to Romania at age 7 with my father, who was a diplomat. I lived with him for a few months before I was taken. I had little chance to master Romanian and only had a limited understanding of the language. A sudden twitch from him gave me enough strength to let go and hide before the lounge. He rose, touching his wound, and went towards the bedroom. I crawled on the floor, hoping I wouldn't be noticed, and entered Anais's room. She moved in her sleep when she heard my footsteps and seemed to wake up, so I let myself fall to the floor, as if I accidentally fell from the shelf where I usually stayed. Anais stood up, aroused by my movements and her father's swear words from the other room. I played dead on the floor. Anais slowly came towards me and with a sad and playful tone said, "What are you doing there, Luna?" She picked me up and tried to put me back on the shelf. I quickly licked my lips, but she didn't notice. Unable to place me there, she decided to put me to bed with her. Being an expensive artifact, she was discouraged from doing this. At that moment, I still felt the need for more blood. As she held me, I had to fight hard not to bite her neck. The poor little soul had no idea she was holding a predator who wanted to take her life. I clenched my fists to stop myself. It would have been a disaster if I had bitten her. I would have been discovered, and Aeneas didn't deserve this. I thought about turning her into the same thing I was, but realized I couldn't teach her the ways. We would have needed to hunt often, and I wasn't very good at it, even though I learned some things from the one whose blood was used to turn me. The woman who helped me, whom I called Mum, talked to me, made me move, and took me for night walks in the city. She hunted at first, giving me blood from the victim. She taught me how to hunt, not just by force, but by being cunning. But as I was kept as a doll most of the time, I couldn't get too skilled. Aeneas and I would have had a hard time surviving on our own. My mum taught me how to read and write. She would read aloud to me and give me books to read myself, even though it was risky for her. That night was terrible. I kept thinking of the strength I would have gained by draining Aeneas completely, or turning her into the same thing I was. I didn't know if I could do it, but since she was small, I had a chance. No, it would have been worse than killing her. I was a monster for sure. Perhaps it would have been better to be killed altogether. I even planned to end my existence as Aeneas slept peacefully. When Aeneas's mother first brought me in, Aeneas felt uneasy around me. I used to be part of a private collection, and before that, an exhibit in a museum. I didn't get to enjoy this glory much since I slept most of the time. Before that, I was a Christmas present for another little girl. I don't remember much about that time. It seems Christmas is close here too, but I had no idea what year it was or what floor of the building we were on. The TV was pretty big, and the adults had shiny devices that I didn't understand. Aeneas enjoyed them sometimes, and I peeked at them too. If I knew more, I might have dared to use them myself, but I had no idea how. At first, they felt uneasy around me. Their human nature had an instinctual reaction to creatures like me. The cat hissed at me and even charged at me several times. Fortunately, when I was alone in the house with him, I showed him what I was capable of, and he kept his distance ever since. They all got used to me, and I was conscious more often than before. I don't know why. Maybe being closer to humans and in touch with them caused this. They seemed at ease with me now, but not at ease in general. Even I started to feel uneasy, like something was creeping in. Aeneas brought me down from the shelf, lying to her parents to have me in bed with her. They scolded her several times, fearing I would break, thinking I was made of porcelain. I was not made of porcelain, but of flesh and blood, but they didn't know that. They settled down when they noticed I seemed unharmed by the falls. Aeneas held me in her arms, and as she slept, I tried to hold her in mine. She was warm, the warmth of a living human I lacked and missed so much. On the other hand, I felt powerless to stop being a doll in front of them and speak to them. The magic that was upon me was strong. Yet, when I felt that presence the night before, staring from behind the door glass at us, I grabbed Aeneas's hand and held her tight. It was a strange fear, something I hadn't felt since I was human. I remember it felt like a presence I never saw in Scotland before I came to Romania. Aeneas seemed to feel it too. That morning, I heard a conversation between Aeneas and her father. She was scolded for having me in bed with her. She said she felt Bao Bao was close and was very afraid. Her father said they had many problems already, financial or otherwise, that needed fixing, like repairing the radiator pipes in the other room, and told her to stop acting like that. Aeneas was disturbed, and I wished I could help her, but I couldn't. It was during the day, and it was unusual for me to be awake at this time. In the end, her father said it would be hard for her, but she needed to accept the hardship ahead because it was for her own good and that things would be better after the hardship. Aeneas clearly felt that the hardship was something to be very afraid of. In Romanian, Bao Bao is the name for the bogeyman. What I sensed the night before felt very much like the fear I had back in Scotland on dark nights when I was alone in my bed, trembling and sobbing that the bogeyman would come for me. After all I had been through for this whole century, I never forgot that feeling. I felt it again the night before, and during that day, something was clearly coming when night fell. Aeneas felt the same, I could tell. I wished I could move and speak now. You see, I am a creature of the night, of the dark. I do not feel well in the daytime, but this time, I was afraid of the night to come. I couldn't sleep at all that day, The adults kept arguing as the autumn cold crept in due to the broken radiator. They scolded Anais for petty things. She came to me, trying to comfort herself. She played with me, brushed my hair. I usually didn't like this much since my hair is very curly, and she often pulled it too much, tangling it and making my scalp hurt, and took care of my dress and shoes. Fortunately, she never fully undressed me, as that would have revealed something surprising. Anais's grandparents came to visit at sunset. Something really weird was happening. As night fell, I became able to move. Anais was brought before her parents and grandparents in the other room. They kept telling her to obey and accept what was coming, that it was for her own good. They raised their voices in a way I had never heard before. They started to behave unnaturally, hard to describe how, but their attitude seemed clearly off. At some point the doorbell rang, and Anais's mother said, "Well, he is here now, to take care of the radiator and then to take care of us. Behave yourself and get ready." The apartment door opened, and Anais ran to me, closing the door behind her. She looked visibly scared and turned towards me. I looked into her eyes. I don't know if she realized this, but I could sense something was present in the other room, something I wasn't sure what it was, but I surely didn't want to face it. The parents and grandparents were mostly silent as someone worked on the radiator to fix it. Was this just the plumber? No way. It was a matter of minutes before the maintenance was over and the door would open. Anais started to sob as she felt it too. I started thinking about a way to escape. The only way out was through the window. I didn't know what floor we were on, but a pretty large tree was in front of the window. The only chance was to jump and grab a branch and then somehow find a way down. I needed to act fast now. I climbed down from the shelf, and Anais turned to look at me. She seemed shocked and scared to see me alive. Her eyes were wide open with horror as she stared into my living eyes, which were not those of an inanimate doll. Then, I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I spoke. "Anais." I took a deep breath and continued. "Anais, we need to get out of here." I said it firmly, but it felt almost impossible to achieve. Anais looked at me, then at the door, and back at me. Her lower lip trembled. I started to walk towards her, just a few steps away. Her mind seemed to freeze, probably unable to process what was happening. Perhaps if I had revealed myself earlier, I don't know what could have been, but my mind keeps going back to those moments. The door suddenly opened. I hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. An intoxicating light spilled into the room. It was the same room I knew well, but it looked like it belonged to another world, a different dimension. The light was strange, maybe lemony or milky, or a mix of both. It was neither natural nor man-made, even more unnatural than any artificial light. Anais's parents and grandparents stepped forward. They seemed taller, holding their heads high, their eyes wide open and greyish. They looked at us but seemed to gaze beyond us. Their mouths were slightly open. Anais's mother's hair stood up like she was electrocuted. She spoke in a voice that physically sounded like hers, but also like something from another world, calm, monotone, and much colder than any tombstone. "My dear Anais, I am sorry for bringing this unwanted nuisance into our home. Although it sat on the shelf most of the time, you were in real danger from this presence, and it is my fault. I am sorry. As I told you, our rescuer is here. He will solve this problem and all our problems. You need to submit to him and let him take care of you. We know we told you to be scared of him, but now I tell you, no matter how hard it will be, it is for your own good and ours. So, go ahead and go to our rescuer. Bao Bao." Hearing the name Bao Bao made the hair on my head stand up stiffly for the first time. Both my human and non-human parts felt terrified. If I were still human, my heart would have started beating faster, and I would have been covered in cold sweat. But that couldn't happen, making it even worse. The room felt like a tunnel, growing deeper. Then we saw him, the source of this new reality. At first glance, he was an old man, a bit bald, with mostly black, greasy hair. He wore thick-framed, large glasses. His beard was shaved, but the stubble made his face look like it was covered in tiny holes. He wore work overalls with blue braces, typical for a plumber, and it was clear he had just fixed the radiator, but he had no mouth. He looked at us silently, like a silent rescuer, our silent savior. I looked into his eyes, which seemed like abyssal holes absorbing my mind. Something in me tried to fight this, but the pulling got stronger. Not only his eyes, but also the holes where his beard should be were pulling me in. I opened my mouth to scream, but it seemed Anais couldn't scream either. Then a wall-shaking scream burst out of her mouth, allowing me to scream for the first time in my non-human life. I tried to pull Aeneas's dress towards me in desperation, but Bao Bao reached us and grabbed her. I felt powerless to save Aeneas. Bao Bao laid his hands on her, and I decided to save myself. I ran towards the table next to the window. Aeneas's parents threw her towards Bao Bao. Her screams grew louder as I managed to jump on the table and open the window. Aeneas gave one last scream that reached the marrow of my bones as I got ready to jump into the rainy night. I leaped towards a tree branch. I missed the nearest branch and fell, grabbing a lower branch unconsciously. The unnatural light was behind me, and the polluted city air pushed me away from the apartment. I realized I needed to get down quickly, as I was several floors high. I used my hands to move closer to the tree trunk and settled there for a few seconds. I breathed heavily, looking at the apartment. The unnatural light was expanding from the window, searching for me. I tried to climb down, but the wet wood made me slip. I grabbed another lower branch. The light seemed to move slowly to the ground, or maybe stopped altogether. I had a decision to make. I couldn't climb down the tree easily and fast enough because it was wet, so I decided to let myself go in a controlled way, hoping to catch another branch before hitting the ground. My plan worked, though not as smoothly as I hoped. I fell swiftly and grabbed a lower branch, feeling my heart in my throat. The light was more distant now. I repeated the move, this time with greater success, until I reached a branch not far from the ground. I let go, hoping for the best. The landing hurt more than I expected, but I managed to move sideways towards the tree trunk. The branches scratched my velvet dress, and wet leaves stuck to it. The brushwood on the ground and dirty raindrops reached my pale, porcelain-like skin, but I didn't care. The unnatural light was far above now. As I settled with my back against the tree trunk, I remembered Aeneas and started sobbing, maybe even crying. I don't know if I cried, but everything went black soon, and I became my dull self on the wet ground.